Hello, and welcome to this first lecture on the Declaration of Independence. In order to understand the significance of the events of 1776 and the purpose of the events of 1776, it's really important to have at least some broad understanding of the historical context in which these American colonists found themselves. And so that's the goal of this first lecture. It's going to be very broad, but will hopefully just give you some background context to better understand the context that led to the writing of the Declaration of Independence. So to truly understand the events that will take place in the summer of 1776, we have to go back to the origins of European settlements and what will become the United States and larger parts of North and South America. Following the discovery of the Americas in 1492, several European empires make efforts to control the New World. Now, they will do so in different ways. Some seem to just be interested in sending military and expanding trade and extracting resources, or protecting their own trade routes. Others are more interested in overtaking empires that are already in place in the Americas. And they want to exploit these empires for their own gains, for their own power in the world. And in some other cases, like the British colonies, you see a mix of commercial goals for establishing a foothold in what will become the eastern seaboard of the U.S., but you also see some latitude at different points. In this original story, for people to lay claims in parts of the British Americas for reasons like religious liberty. If you remember the stories of the Puritans and other colonists that will settle New England, it's one more of religious liberty than the story of Jamestown, which is one about commerce. Of course, to have this discussion, one must understand that there were native populations that were displaced by the conquest of the Europeans. Here's a map depicting the known indigenous tribes across the continental U.S. on the eve of the colonization. The first people that will be displaced are those groups on the eastern seaboard. These include native populations like Iroquois, Delaware, Powhatan, Cherokee, and Creek. They'll be pushed westward as a consequence of warfare and disease, and the sad story will continue well into the 19th and 20th century. The larger story of Native Americans and indigenous peoples will not be told in this lecture or this class, but we should certainly pause and reflect on how the colonist treatment of the native population is one of the many contradictions that we're going to see in our founding period. The principles spelled out in the documents and the ones that we revere aren't even lived up to by their authors, most notably the treatment of Native Americans and the institution of slavery, often referred to as America's original sin. I also just want to pause and point out that some of these civilizations were much more advanced than we give them credit for. For example, here's an image of Cahokia. This was a large city. It was built in what is modern-day Illinois, just north of St. Louis, Missouri. At its height in the 1300s, it had a population larger than London. Now, I also want to point out that to the west of the original colonies, and if you're a student of American history or of geography, you may notice that these colonies don't even go as far west as the states that replace them ultimately will. And that is because right at the crest of the Appalachian Mountains was land claimed by France. Jacques Cartier of France claimed North America for France in 1534. The French, though, were more interested in establishing commercial trading posts, mainly interest in fur. They established better relations with the Native Americans, built on their mutual benefits of trade. New France remained rather small compared to the colonies controlled by England. England was more permissive of colonial settlement because of its economic benefit. Colonists brought them raw materials and provided goods that required farming and long-term commitment to the land, like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Now, the British established their first permanent settlement in 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia. It's important to note that the colonies were given quite a bit of autonomy even from the start. By 1650, each of the colonies that have become settled by England had locally elected legislatures. And even though there was a governor appointed by the king, They largely had a cordial relationship with British leaders and were given much latitude in the collective decisions that they made for their own colony. You'll see that the map here denotes the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. Let me give you just a quick overview of these differences because this is a helpful way to think of the colonies and their interest. So in short, the New England colonies were mainly settled by quasi-theocratic communities in an area with rocky soil. Most people survived on small plots of land for food, and they engaged in cross-Atlantic trade with England, especially for fish, lumber, and furs. Boston was first settled in 1630. It soon became one of the main trading centers of North America and a critical harbor and port for the colonies. Before the Revolution, the population is just around 15,000. The middle colonies are really an interesting mix of states. New York was first populated by the Dutch in between the founding of Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620. Due to a series of conflicts, the Dutch handed over New Amsterdam to the British in the 1670s. New Jersey, similarly, was first held by Sweden in 1638, then absorbed by the Dutch in the 1650s, finally handed over to England in the 1670s. Pennsylvania was established to clear out old debts to William Penn. William Penn was a Quaker, and his influence from being persecuted for his religion had a large impact on Pennsylvania culture. First, many Quakers immigrated to Pennsylvania and continue to live in the southeastern part of the state. Second, Quakers are known for their pacifism, and they had the most enlightened relationship of any of the colonies with the Native Americans. Penn's own experience with religious persecution led to a state that actually allowed for more religious liberty than any of the other colonies. Land was better than New England, and the western frontier of the middle colonies were dominated by smallhold farmers. Meanwhile, the coastal cities were dominated by merchants selling products to England. Political culture and conflict really circled around this tension between the western farmers and the coastal elites of New York City and Philadelphia. Finally, we go to the southern colonies, which developed a much more pernicious social and economic life. The southern colonies most resembled the social order and socioeconomic structure of England. Large landowners dominated a population of indebted freeholders, indentured servants, and African slaves, propped up by the Anglican Church. They believed mightily in their rights as Englishmen, and if you look at the colonies in the South, they're very separate entities that bickered constantly over land boundaries and access to resources. But they are very united in their shared relationship with England. We don't see as large of cities in the South, and this is partly due to geography. The South is full of deep navigable rivers, so any landowner could put up a dock rather than rely on overland shipping to a central hub, much like people had to do in Boston, Philadelphia, or New York. The South also had the best land for farming, so we see large farms and plantations being built over small farming towns. Now, the notion of these colonies as some kind of united force doesn't really start to become prominent until the 1750s. This is actually a political cartoon that was created by Benjamin Franklin and published in the Philadelphia Gazette in 1754. And the purpose of that column and this cartoon was to show that these colonies would never work as intended if they don't start to unite. And so the idea here is that South Carolina alone becomes lifeless, right? Separated from the snake. And the same with North Carolina. Virginia is a little bigger because it's a very large colony at the time. I believe this is Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and then he got a little lazy at the head and it's just all of New England. He skips Georgia for some reason. Don't really know why. At the same time that Franklin composed this column, you also have what is called the Albany Plan, which is a meeting of leaders from several of the colonies, just about half of them, to discuss a need for greater coordination, both economically and militarily. At this point, it was mainly over relations with the Native American tribes. They were working out a treaty with the Iroquois Nation at this point. Now, the real starting point, though, for conflicts between the English and the colonists really becomes a flashpoint during the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War because we have major empires in conflicts in other parts of the globe as well. This war that lasted 7 years was also the stage of first combat for many colonists that would go on to fight for the United States. Most notably, George Washington led a command during the French and Indian War, as did Benedict Arnold and a few other military leaders that we'll see in the Revolutionary War some 20 years later. Great Britain ultimately prevails in this conflict, and as a result, the French exit much of the continental United States at this time. Here's a depiction of the empire's boundaries before 1754 on the left, and we see France with all of this territory in the central United States, the plains going all the way up in through Canada. And at the end, we see that the French are out, and now the British have claim to much of this territory, although there still is quite a bit of conflict between colonial interest and relationships with indigenous people who are living in this Indian reserve just west of the Appalachians. So a few things occur, though, with the relationship between the colonists and the English after the French and Indian War. One move by the British that was particularly unpopular was the designation of this proclamation line of 1763. You had many colonists that were interested in expanding westward. They saw opportunities for land and resources just beyond the foothills of the Appalachians that they wanted to explore. The British restricted that, and that did frustrate many colonists who thought that they were boxed in economically based off of British rule. The Crown also left thousands of troops in the colonies after the French and Indian War. And we'll see how this became unpopular and is really a reason why we have the Third Amendment, which is the restrictions of quartering troops. And finally, the British really exhausted their financial reserves during the French and Indian War. And so they saw the colonists as a new tax base that they could extract further resources from. And so it's in the wake of the French and Indian War that as the British passed taxes to extract resources from the colonists, we see increased resistance and even violence as a result of these policies. So the Stamp Act was the first major act passed, and it required stamps on numerous documents and even playing cards. And so it became a prohibitive cost for many colonists and a point of frustration. This is the beginning of the saying no taxation without representation, because colonists believed that without a voice in Parliament, that these taxes were illegitimate. Next come the Townshend Acts, named after the member of Parliament who sponsored these acts, and they add more taxes, in particular to imports like glass and tea. In 1770, the tensions finally boil over into a violent conflict in Boston Harbor. This is probably an image that you are all familiar with, that you have seen in government textbooks. This was actually an image created by Paul Revere, and while it is effective in portraying the British as cold-blooded killers, the actual story of the Boston Massacre is quite a bit more complicated. The Boston Massacre, even though it occurs a full 6 years for the Declaration of Independence, was a galvanizing event for all of the colonists. John Adams even wrote that the foundation of American independence was laid that night. There is more back and forth that we will see, and of course this timeline obscures all of the small decisions of both resistance and dissent from the colonists, as well as decisions to further crack down by the British. And so these tensions continue to bubble up. In December of 1773, colonists will sneak onto British ships and dump over 400 caskets of tea into the Boston Harbor, what is roughly valued at about $1.7 million in today's currency. Soon after that, the British go a step further with the Intolerable Acts, which I'll show you a video of. And then even a year before the Declaration, we already have bloodshed in Massachusetts at the battles of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. This video clip provides an excellent illustration of the tensions between the British and the Americans. You will also see some of the details laid out in this video about what the Intolerable Acts actually were, and you will also get a dramatization of the colonist reaction to this. And finally, we will see how John Adams, who is the main character in this, and he's standing by his wife Abigail at the beginning of this clip, John Adams will then be asked to consider joining this Continental Congress to discuss further American unity. He's going to have that discussion with his cousin, Samuel Adams.
Whereas dangerous insurrections have been fomented in the town of Boston to the utter subversion of His Majesty's government and the utter destruction of the public peace, be it enacted that no goods or merchandise whatever be transported to or brought from any other colony or country. Be it enacted that for the suppression of riots and tumults, all disturbers of the King's peace that have been transported to England for trial. Any British soldier or officer charged with a capital crime will in like manner be transported out of the colony to receive a fair hearing. Be it enacted that for better regulating the government of Massachusetts, the present council is to be immediately disbanded. Be it enacted that Royal Army officers are authorized to quarter their troops among the citizenry. General Thomas Gage is hereby dispatched with 4 of our regiments to compel compliance with all these measures.
Gage's ships will close up the bay and cut us off from the rest of the country.
Boston must suffer martyrdom. Our principal consolation is that it dies a noble death.
Our people will not stand idly by. They have weapons, and they know how to use them.
Against the British Empire?
The Congress will be meeting in Philadelphia to determine how to recover our rights and liberties. I've nominated you to represent Massachusetts. We're sending 5 men. You should be among them.
Does this Congress have any legal authority? Since all assemblies have been outlawed, I cannot imagine that it does. Sam, I repeat, does this Congress have any legal authority?
Toss pots.
So that clip ends with Samuel Adams inviting his cousin John Adams to what will be a meeting of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And these Continental Congresses that meet in 1775 and again in 1776 will ultimately decide to sever their relationship with Great Britain. We will get into that in the next lecture, but I want to give you just a brief summary of some of the key takeaways from this lecture. One is we need to remember just how unique these 13 colonies are. They all have different experiences. Some are settled for religious liberty reasons, like many of the New England colonies, while others are settled more for economic reasons, like the southern colonies. And for a long period of time, we're talking a couple of generations here, the colonists, while British subjects, had quite a bit of autonomy in terms of the decisions they made for life in the colonies. This period is characterized as one of salutary or benign neglect by historians. And so as we think about this march towards independence, it's important to remember that the colonies are all unique, have their own interest, have their own experience with Great Britain, and have their own cultures and politics, and are not necessarily inclined to have natural affinities for one another. This will build over time. At the same time, that period of salutary and benign neglect allowed for leaders in the colonies to develop some of the critical political skills that would be necessary to ultimately declare independence, wage a war, and then set up a new form of government. Finally, this relationship of salutary and benign neglect starts to fall apart in the wake of the French and Indian War. And what we really see in this period of 1763 to 1776 is an increasing series of hostile acts, both in decisions that the British Crown will make to impose more rules and restrictions and taxes on the colonists, and the decisions that colonists make about resisting these policies coming from England. These tensions will ultimately erupt into the American Revolution, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture.